Right, well, good evening everyone, and it's lovely to be back. And we have a whistle-stop tour of basically the roots of bonsai. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Amelia Williams, and I'm an arboriculturalist of 25 years now, gosh, and a bonsai enthusiast since 2006. So I've had my fair share of playing with trees of all sizes, from basically bonsai right through to full-size mature trees. And we're just going to run through very quickly tonight some very basics around tree roots, what they do, what they're for, the importance of them and everything to do with the tree roots. And for me, the part of the bonsai tree that's often overlooked, underloved and forgotten about. And I see a beautiful collection of your own trees here tonight, and hopefully we might get a quick chance to have a look at some of those as well, either during the break or hopefully possibly during the presentation. The other quick one is I bought some pots along. If anyone's interested in buying any, please have a look. The little ones are just sort of like small donations, but some of the big ones have got prices on, but only if you're interested. But anyway, back to the talk, the roots of bonsai. So, the importance of tree roots. We're looking at a majestic bonsai on the right-hand side there. Amazing, what we would call nebari. So this area of the tree, this is the nebari that then leads down to the root system. And it is the hidden treasure of your bonsai tree. This is where all the really exciting and interesting things happen within that space. And you never get to see it unless you repot, unless you play with the roots of the trees. When you put it out on display, the only thing you see is the above ground section. But that is as crucial, because if your eye is drawn to that section of the tree, you might be missing the whole concept of the tree. So the root system and the nebari is a really important part. And it's basically how you start your tree off, by giving your tree a good foundation. It is the foundation of your bonsai. So good roots are developed through well-timed pruning and setting out from the beginning. So whenever or however you're developing a bonsai, whether you're buying trees, you still need to make sure that the root system is good. If you're growing from seed, you'll develop the roots to hopefully set the foundation for your bonsai. It is the key to the survival of your tree. If you have no roots, your bonsai won't survive. So you really need to have a good root system. And they deserve your attention. They're fascinating. They are absolutely stunning. And I hopefully, through this presentation, show you how stunning they are. So, having played with roots, what is their function? They take up water. They basically absorb minerals. They conduct and absorb water from the soils. They anchor the tree into the ground, and in our case, into the pot. Tap roots resist the wind rock when they're starting to early form from seeds. So a tree will put out a taproot initially, which basically anchors it into the soil it's growing in. And then beyond that, they develop and establish fibrous roots. And that fibrous root system is what we're interested in as bonsai enthusiasts. And they store nutrients. So a lot of people think that the nutrients are sort of stored perhaps elsewhere in the tree. This is one of the key places where the tree actually stores nutrients to help it over periods like over winter. So on the right-hand side, you'll see a swamp cypress I've been developing. And look at the root system on that. They're all fibrous roots though. And that's gone from having a structural root system to a fibrous root system through the root work and root pruning. And the reason we're looking to change the root structure of our trees is because we're keeping them in pots. So if you can bypass the need for them to put out structural roots and develop fibrous roots, you get a much more better absorbent pad of roots. And to do that, we'll talk about the different techniques of how you actually achieve that, but you're trying to convert the tree's ability to produce structural roots into fibrous. And the best way we do that is that we wire our trees into the pots. So hopefully everyone in the room, show of hands, who wires their trees into their pots? Yay! Oh my goodness, nearly 100%, fantastic. So just having a look at a large mature tree, this was a beech tree in my local area, and roots are really shallow. So in terms of when you look at majestic trees out in the landscape, you might assume and think that they've got really deep roots. But most tree roots are in the top 500 to 600 mil of soil. And in our area where we are on chalk, we're probably talking about the top 300 to 400 mil of soil. So you're not thinking of really deep roots, even on trees as big as that. And as I say, they start out with a taproot. Not all species, but most species of trees will develop with a taproot to start with. And over time, that taproot is basically decayed, degraded, and it develops these massive, great big structural roots, which then fan out into feeder roots or fibrous roots. So root anchorage, you can see when this tree fell over, really shallow soil, it brought up some of the chalk with it, but there's no root within the chalk. So it's just in the topsoil and that really nice organic layer. But you think of how small a root system that is for such a big tree. It's phenomenal when you actually think about how small the actual structural root system is. Beyond that would have been a massive fibrous pad that spanned out to at least underneath the canopy of the tree. But when it fractured and fell over, you're left with just viewing the structural roots. So in comparison then to bonsai, this is a Styrax japonica. This is the Japanese snowbell tree. And over time, it develops a really nice, spongy, fibrous root pad. This is what you're looking to create. When you're developing your bonsai roots, have an image like that in your mind of a really nice, fully functioning, really compact set of roots. Every single one of those roots is live, so look at the coloration, look at the health of the root system. That's what you're looking for when you're repotting. However, some of you might not experience that because not every tree has the same colour roots. So be aware that root colour changes with species. Also, root thickness or sort of, I suppose, fleshiness also varies by species. And some species will develop really nice fibrous root pads with all the development you give them, others won't. So I work with figs. I am slowly getting my tropical figs, the Taiwanese figs, to develop better fibrous root systems, but they're not by anywhere as like a Styrax japonica. So things like your privets, your cotoneasters, pyrocanthers, quite a lot of the more shrub-forming varieties will develop really nice fibrous root pads. But some of the other species will take a bit longer. Perhaps you'll need to work them slightly harder to get them to develop that fibrous root pad. And then think about, again, coloration. You won't see any of this once it's in the soil. So the root colour doesn't matter per se, but it's just useful to know what a healthy root looks like. And I'll show you what an unhealthy root looks like later on. So these roots need to be the highest functioning capacity they can be. You're trying to, in a very small space in a pot, keep the roots to be the most functioning, absorbent pad that you can ever create. That's the joy of how we work with bonsai. It's not about starving your trees, it's not about restricting them per se, but it's about making that root system the most efficient it can be and giving it the right soil conditions, the right aeration and the right level of nutrients to do that. So root growth, when do tree roots grow? Most people have put their trees away for the winter and not really thought about them possibly. But roots grow all year round. And these were little acorns that I planted up in the autumn. And there's nothing above ground at the top of the pot, but underneath the pot, this is what they're doing. They're setting root before the spring. So they are growing roots over the winter period. And so the root system is still active. The rest of the tree for a broadleaf is dormant, it's got no leaves, but actually the root system is still active. So your trees are still doing a huge amount without you even noticing. And this is where we come on to repotting. Even though we are looking to disturb those roots while they're active, which is actually a good thing, you need to just be aware that they are actively working, growing and developing. So it's just something to realise that a lot of people do put their trees away for the winter and assume that nothing is going on with them. But actually, it's far from the truth. A lot is happening. We just don't see it. So root hormones, what controls roots? So roots are basically stimulated by their environment, but also there's hormones inside each of the roots with fine root hairs. And the key hormones you're looking for are cytokinins and ethylene. You can, if you feel the need, increase the amount of hormones. You can buy supplements, but actually trees have evolved for millennia, for millions of years. And so Therefore, they should hopefully have the right level of hormones within their systems and their cells to promote their own growth naturally. There are some products out there on the system. There's one chap, I think, who was from Liverpool, who's been selling plant growth hormones. And if you feel that your tree needs an extra bit of a sort of pep, bit of a buzz, then you could possibly start to introduce hormones, but I haven't experimented with them. Tend to use more nutrients that are focused around what the roots need for growth. So there's 3 main nutrients that you're looking at, which is sulfur, phosphorus and copper. And the quickest source for the phosphorus is a bone meal. So if you put a little bit of bone meal in your soil mix, it's really quite like more like a powder. But also if you feed with things like liquid seaweed, that's where you get all your micronutrients, so your sulfurs and your coppers, just to help basically your root development. But if a tree is functioning, if it's healthy, it will naturally take up those nutrients from soils. However, because of some of the soils we use for bonsai, they're quite inert. So things like akadama, the kiryus, they haven't got any nutrients really that are available to the trees. So that's why we need to artificially feed to give them those levels of nutrients. And the ones to focus on if you want root growth are those 3. So bonsai tree roots. This is how we develop the fibrous, so supporting them, so putting wires in. So when you start to repot and you think about repotting, and I'll show you a video in a minute, don't make the mistake that I did and not prepare your pot before you repot. And think about, does your tree need to go into a different pot? Is it in the right pot at the stage of its development that it's in? So if you're going to put it back in the same pot, then just be aware to have your wire cut and your little mesh pieces ready and have it prepared. And then when you've taken the tree out the pot, the key thing is not to let it dry out. The root system is not used to being in open air. So if you're repotting particularly outside this time of year, there's quite a cold wind, your roots will dry out really quickly, in minutes even. If you think, going back to that picture of the styrax, it's got really lightweight, fluffy, fibrous roots. Exposed to air, they will dry out really quickly. So 2 options is to have a bag of sphagnum moss and just keep it moist and put the root system back in there and bag it until you get ready to repot it into the new pot or the existing pot once you've cleaned it. Or have a bucket of water available that you can just leave it in, not for an extended period of time, but for 5 minutes. And try not to perhaps go and have a cup of tea in between your repotting. Get your tree back in a soil before you actually leave it exposed. When we do planting out in nature and we're planting bare root trees, anyone planted bare root? When you take them out the bag that they've been given to you in, they very quickly dry out. So you literally want to take it out of the plastic bag and literally heel it into the ground or plant it straight away. Because if you lose that fibrous root system, your tree will suffer. And it won't show you immediately that it's suffered, but over time you'll start to see the decline. So repotting is quite a traumatic experience for trees. So just make sure you're prepared and ready. And then again, having all the right tools available, we'll talk through the different tools, but you can see here, you've got some wire cutters and pliers, you've got your mesh already put in the pots. And in between, when you repot, think about how clean the pot is. This is your opportunity to not only look at the root system of the tree, but to actually clean your pots. If it's covered in limescale, if it's had any previous pest issues, this is your time to clean the pot or even change the pot. Because you'll realise as you get into the hobby over time that some pots are better than others. And you'll see from the range of pots here, some pots are glazed, some are not, some have got a really good feel and clay make to them. Some of them are a really poor quality clay even, that actually they can affect how your tree grows. There are certain potters I don't tend to favour because I can't get my trees to grow well in their pots. I couldn't tell you exactly why, but some pots and some trees just don't go hand in hand. So there's a lot to think about when you're repotting. This is your opportunity also to look at your root development. So how you grow trees, how you develop them, how you make your bonsais. So whether you buy nursery stock, so this is from a garden centre, this is a little Akiba, and it's a little climbing plant that actually over time you can develop a really nice thick trunk. This one had beautiful white flowers. I think that was the white variety. But look at the root system that you're buying. So when you buy from a garden centre, don't expect to have good roots. Expect to have roots, but often find that they're girdling. They're whirling round in the pot because they've been stuck in that pot for a long period of time. You might even find that you've got one set here and then you start to tease the root system out and you find the previous pot size it was in because they've just, to basically charge more for it because they're growing it on, have just moved it from one pot size to the next without doing any root work. Because if you think the value of what you're paying in a garden centre, they don't have the funding time on that plant material to develop the roots. As long as the roots are there and it's alive, that's all they need to do is provide you with a tree or a plant with roots, hopefully. But their interest and their investment in the root system is nowhere near like we do for bonsai. So just be aware of that if you are starting out with nursery stock, that you might find that you have to do a lot of root work in the first few years before you even start to worry about what the crown is doing. If you're growing yourself from cuttings or from seed, you have much more control over the root system from the start. You should be developing then a really nice root system. You're able to continually go in and prune it once a year, train it and develop it. So there's nothing wrong with starting with nursery stock at all. It gets you a really nice good trunk and everything else, but just be aware that you'll need to do some root work first to get it into a proper sort of state where the roots are fully functioning and not girdling round and round. Because if you carefully tease these out, which is what you should do, you'll find that if you unravel them, they're about 1 metre in length. But our pots aren't 1 metre in length in depth when we pot them up, so you'll want to start to root prune. But you don't want to take off, same rule with the crown, you don't want to take off more than 1/3 at any one sitting. The only times I would say as the exception is when you're getting a nursery stock plant that is so pot bound that there is no soil to tease out and you just can't get to the roots. So you then get the saw out and you cut the first bottom third off and then start to work backwards. But just be aware that you're traumatically attacking the tree, so don't work on the top and the bottom at the same time because it's just a lot of stress. So if you are repotting and doing some major root work, do not do any crown work, wiring or anything else at the same time. So root development will vary by species and it will also develop with your stages of bonsai. So some trees you'll have to work really hard with. Some species are incredibly, I would say, thug-like with their root development. Has anyone tried giant redwoods? Coastal redwoods, the one I had, swamp cypress. Some of the really gigantic tree species have phenomenal fast-growing roots. So you have to then keep on top of the root work. Other species slightly slower, things like your oaks, much slower to develop a really sort of fibrous root system. Hornbeams, particularly the Korean hornbeam, can be a bit slow as well. European is pretty fast. Things like beech as well, once they get going, they're quite good. So you might find that you repot some species more regularly than others as well, depending on, again, the stage of development. If you're starting off with garden centre or nursery stock, you really should be probably repotting every year for the first few years while you're developing the root system. Once you've got an established tree, though, you might slow down the repotting because you don't need to repot it so regularly. So fibrous roots, so good examples here of two different species, the corkbark Chinese elm, and over time you can develop quite a nice fibrous root pad, but the way these are produced you tend to find that they're actually air layers or sort of cut off and you've got a few structural-ish type roots and a bit of fibrous, but a bit messy, so you'll spend quite a bit of time trying to refine this to get this really functioning and really good absorbent pad. As I say, the Taiwanese figs, anything goes really. They are often also air-layered cuttings, and you find they will produce these beautiful aerial roots from random places on the trunk, and you have to decide whether you keep those and develop them or whether you decide to remove them. But if you are deciding to remove a particular root, then you need to make sure that you've got enough accompanying root system in the places you want it. And so we'll come on to root placement in a minute, but thinking about what root system you've got. So in terms of the fig on the right, I probably wouldn't have enough scope to prune that too heavily because there's not much there to start with. That was one of the new figs that I bought. And so the first thing when you buy a tree is that you need to have a look at its root system. You want to know what the roots are before you can get it to do anything. You want to know how much energy, how much capacity it's got as a tree to actually develop. So this one went into a fairly deep pot, into a recovery soil, to get it to just have a bit more time to develop a better root system before I could start thinning it, pruning it out and everything else. So looking at hopefully differences. So the Styrax japonica you've seen earlier, beautiful, really nice fibrous. Acer palmatum's pretty good actually, and look at the thinness that you can actually develop that fibrous pad to. So when you're thinking of what depth of pot to put your trees in, it's all based on how thick your fibrous root pad is. And thicker root pad doesn't always mean higher function. But with certain species like the Acer palmatums, they actually do lend themselves to quite actually a shallow root system. The ginkgos, they will produce any size root. I love them as a species to work with. Some people hate ginkgos, but I've had a lot of fun playing with ginkgos and doing different experiments to see what types of root size and dimension I can produce. I would say that they are good at producing fibrous, but sometimes when you're buying large specimens, this was a tree from a nursery, a tree nursery, so already started with a fairly decent sized trunk. It came with some really big structural roots. And when I say big structural roots, nearly the size of my arm. And so to try and work those backwards to get a fibrous root pad takes a lot more time. And they haven't got the same callousing and wound response in comparison to other species of trees. So when you wound ginkgos, they don't form calluses as easily, and they just don't have the cells in the right places to do that. So you have to know your species as well when you're looking to do more significant root work. So root placement. When you're looking at your root system, if your root system isn't nice and radial, you can start to adjust it in the pot. So I was experimenting with how to basically create that really nice flat root plate. So I used an upside down, the cut off end of a plant pot, just cut off the bottom. And it was an experiment. I didn't know whether it would really work. A lot of people have tried things like cork, slate, drilling holes in plates even. And you just want something to stop the roots growing down. You want them to grow out laterally. And then other mistakes I made was, firstly, I tried to use the mesh, but forgetting that ginkgo is a really thin-barked species. So I have mesh imprint over my roots. And especially if they're going to be roots that you see as part of the nebari, they will have these very interesting patterns on them that you just think, oh, damn it. And those patterns will, over time, grow out. But if you can avoid it, then I start using things like sponges just to add a little bit of bark protection. So you can trial all sorts of things. And if you are just using wire, you can use the clear perspex, or not perspex, but the clear plastic tubing or the black plastic tubing just to feed over the wire to, again, take the pressure off the bark. It just helps then you don't mark the roots and the bark as you're developing them. And then you can also see where weaknesses are, where you've got gaps in your root system, where you want to try and encourage new roots. And there are different techniques to do that. You can import roots into it by grafting them in. So different techniques for thread grafting, but at root level. You can actually score the bark to try and promote budding of roots coming through. So if you've got thin bark species particularly, actually just bark damage itself can encourage roots in those areas. If you score the bark and you pack it with sphagnum like you're doing an air layer, that will also promote root growth. The only thing to do, or to remember with that, is inside the pot, if you're creating very moist conditions, sometimes it can be too moist because the sphagnum is too much, that it gets too wet and you cause root rot. So again, it's just sometimes thinking a bit more about what you're doing. And if you are doing this, don't forget when you put the soil back in to put a label in the pot to remind you that that's there. Because if you leave it too long, you'll find that sometimes it will grow over the mesh or the wire, and you just need to remember that you've actually set that off as an experiment and go back to it. Because sometimes you forget when you've got lots of trees. So things like, again, how to develop. This was the chocolate vine, so not the white variety, but this is the Akiba for the chocolate vine. And this was a garden centre climber that I picked up in 2010. So really sort of 3 long stems that weren't really going to do anything. They were just climbing. Tiny little trunk at the time. So I put it in what we call an air pot, which they're not. They're actually pond baskets, Exhibit A. And because of the aeration, roots need to breathe. So an air pot, or a pot with lots of holes in all the way around, means that you've got good air supply into the pot, which basically means your roots have a good air supply. However, if you are using air pots, remember in the winter to double pot. And the only reason I say that is because, yes, air goes all the way around, but when we're getting frost conditions and really cold air, the roots are literally just sat on the edge of this, and you will very quickly get burn. So the roots will get burnt, and that burning and that sort of damage can go further into the root system than you can imagine. And especially if it's a small tree and you've got a good inch of damage all the way around, that's a lot of root system to lose. But quick solution, get a slightly larger plant pot and just put it in to overwinter. And then it's got a little microhabitat, microclimate inside the pot that protects it from the cold and the winds. And then you can just take it out. What you will find sometimes is that they will actually cheekily push root through the little holes and enjoy the nice humid environment that is inside. But then you can just literally brush those off because they shouldn't be too hard to root unless you've left it in there too long. So little Akiba, as you can see, I double potted it, and you can see then it starts to chuck out roots through the holes. But look at the fibrous roots. In 5 years of root development, trunk thickness is there because you've got a really functioning root system that's able to take up a lot of water, a lot of nutrient, and support a little crown. Crown development-wise wasn't really doing a huge amount apart from pruning it back. And because it's a flowering variety, anything that flowers and fruits takes a lot of energy from the tree. So while you're doing your development stages of trees, particularly for root work, sacrifice flowers and fruit. So pick off the flowers, pick off the fruit. I know it's a criminal shame. You think, oh, it's beautiful, it's just coming into flower, and then you take them all off. But that saves energy. The tree, when it has to do anything, uses a huge amount of resources and energy to do anything. And flowering and fruiting is one of the most energy demanding things a tree does. So once you've got this massive fibrous root, this was in a fairly large air pot or plant pot, I then firstly, when I started to put it into a ceramic pot, chose a really deep pot. I didn't want to disturb it too much. I just wanted to transfer it from its sort of air pot status then into a ceramic. And then kept it in that for a few years till I could then start to develop the crown. So these things you plan and you do in stages. If I'd have literally put it from that pot straight into there, it probably wouldn't have grown the trunk thickness or the development over time. So sometimes it's about working out where your tree needs to be over the next 5 to 10 years. And then once I was happy that it was conditionally accepting the ceramic pot, its crown was developing, you can then halve the pot size and start to put it into a smaller pot. However, this was so vigorous a tree that it was very happily and quickly pushing itself out of that pot. So it's again thinking about how regularly you still need to repot it. So it was still on an annual repot at that stage. So just a quick one to show root development using pots. Another method, and this is a tree, we went to some of the early John Trott workshops. If anyone's been to them, they're brilliant. And we ended up coming away with an English hornbeam or European hornbeam. And it had been quite badly snail and slug damaged, so it gave the bark a nice texture. but it was field grown. So John was growing a lot out in his paddock and starting to style them early on. So it had some root work and it had started to get some branch development, but it still wasn't really there. It had come out the pot and was in a fairly sort of smallish pot. And I kept it in the pot for a small amount of time and just thought, it's not going anywhere. It's not really thriving. I'm not getting the branch development. And the other thing to remember with common hornbeam or European is they're top dominant growers. And what I mean by that is all the energy comes into the top section. It tends to sacrifice its side branches because it wants to grow tall first while it's young. So for the want of space, I put it in the ground in the garden. And look at the trunk thickness. You get a phenomenal flare rooting development. It's got total access to more nutrients, water and soil than it ever would have had back in the pot. So put it into the ground to develop more. However, a few years and I kept pruning it and I forgot one year and the top growth was then phenomenal. It really just pushed massively at the top again. So if you forget them in the ground, you then end up having to take them back further and then start them off again because it was starting to sacrifice its lower branches. So in last year, I've literally removed most of its top point and I'm restructuring it again. So if you are going to grow them in the ground and put your trees in the ground to develop them, check them regularly, prune them regularly, style them in the ground, lift them if you can on an annual or twice a sort of 2 yearly basis just to stop the root development getting too much. But you can't ignore them because if you do, you'll end up when you do start to work on them having to regrow a lot of points again, which you could have actually phased out as you were growing them in the ground. So yes, you get phenomenal trunk thickness, but you get a whole host of problems further down the line that you then have to go backwards then when you're developing the crown and canopy. So it is a good technique to put them in the ground, but don't forget about them. So the alternative is again changing and doing different types of pot depth. So this is a coastal redwood. It started off as a tree nursery sized tree. It had been vandalized, so the top had been snapped off. But when you actually dug down into the pot in the soil, it had this most amazing sort of ghoul type formation, like a mini football really, under the soil. So when you actually dug down in the pot, the soil level was about there, and this was exposed underneath when you exposed it. Phenomenal, and it had loads of little buds sat there waiting to flush. So I thought, perfect, I can reuse this as a bonsai. Not realising quite how phenomenally fast they are for growing roots. They're a brilliant alternative to yew. They're really fast growing. You get all the straight, beautiful characteristics of yew with that reddish bark, really vibrant green foliage, grows in a very similar style to a yew, but fast growing. So if you're looking to get a yew equivalent, then the coastal redwood, the Sequoia sempervirens, is the tree to have, as long as you're happy to basically root prune it every 2-3 months. No, not that bad, twice a year. So I started out in a really big plastic pot with a nice sort of warm sort of soil mix, because they like to be moist, they like to be warm, they don't like it too gritty, but draining but holding moisture. And then started to take it out, repot. So look at the root development, phenomenal root grower. This is being repotted every 6 months. And you've got massive amounts of roots. For a tiny little tree, you've got a lot of roots now to play with. So once you've got this massive functioning root pad, you can't really, because I stretched the photo, so it went from a pot size that was about that sort of depth to then a pot size that sort of depth. So put it in a shallow plastic trays, you know, the plastic plant pot trays that you put underneath pots, drilled some holes in it and moved it across into one of those. So you're then training it outwards to have a sort of a lateral root spread rather than a deep root. So quite quick turnaround really. They're quite quick to produce as nice little bonsais. So typical root problems. So we're looking at when you're selecting a tree, whether you're going to a nursery trader, whether you're buying from club members, look at the tree, smell its roots, if it's not wired into the pot, you can easily, but if it is, you can still have a smell of its root system. So you're looking for all these features. Also, when you're taking your trees out of the pots, are they circling? Is it pot bound? So even if you're in plastic pots, you test out the edges of the pot. Is it pushing out the edges? I grow succulents as well as bonsai, and one of my succulents, I think it was about 3 days before it was going into the national show, I turned the pot round and there was a massive split in the plastic pot because it's Phocea edulis, which is an enormous cordex forming succulent that was just, its root system in the pot were just pushing out the sides, and it had managed to fracture the pot. And this was 2 days before the national show. I didn't really want to be repotting it, but we did, and fortunately he won his class, so I was very grateful. But yeah, so when you even touch the pot, you can even see in ceramic pots where they're lifting themselves out of the pot, you know when it's pot bound. I picked up an English elm last year at a show. It was actually at the boot sale, and beautiful tree, but there was something about it that told me that it wasn't growing anymore. It was sat in stasis. And I repotted it last weekend. I now know why. It was totally pot bound. So if your tree isn't flushing and giving you good growth each year, there's often a reason, and it's usually in the pot. It's because your pot roots are so tight that there's no soil, there's no air, there's no ability for them to grow. So we need to keep an eye on those sorts of problems. And again, this is a tiny little elm that came again from a nursery. Shocking roots. Actually, one side was totally missing. There were no roots on one side. The roots that were there were just, yeah, in a real mess, just rotten and damaged, massive bark damage and missing bark as well. It's recoverable, but you know that you're going to need to spend some time with that tree with root work before you can grow the top. So avoid things with uneven roots, one-sided, root rot, infected roots, because you will just end up having to spend a lot more time developing. You can fix most of those problems, but sometimes it's better to start off with trees that don't have such problems. And a typical example, this was at a club. We were given some trees from a bonsai enthusiast who sadly had passed, and we all got some to go and take home and rehabilitate. And this was a little oak that we wondered why it looked very unhappy. So took it out the pot, and just the smell alone was enough to make you realise that the root system was what we call anaerobic. It was full of bacteria. It was claggy, it was cold, it was wet. And this was a grower that basically was using the old bits of ceramic horticultural clays in the bottom of the pots. And they were thought to help with aeration and provide that sort of drainage layer. They are one of the worst things you can use, because the way that they overlap with especially the curvature of the ceramic pots when they're broken, that you end up with huge wet air spaces and pore spaces in the bottom of the pots, which basically means that they can either store too much water, they don't actually drain very well, they make your pots very heavy, but they also make it really like dank and waterlogged, which is not the sort of environment roots like to grow for most species. So really heavily high levels of bacteria, roots rotting. When we tried to wash off what roots were alive, there was very little live root system left. And so you're looking at significant recovery time for something like that, if it even will recover, depending on how long it's been in those conditions. So how do you know when to repot? We've talked through some of those, but when you take it out the pot, it's got literally very little soil space, and it's mainly just full of roots. So you want to make sure that your trees don't end up like this sort of over a long period of time. You want to keep making sure that your roots are better than this, that they're active, that there's a really nice fibrous root pad. And then you've got pest problems, other things that can affect your roots, from vine weevil through to cockchafer larvae, anything slugs and snails. There are lots of things that can get into your bonsai pots, as well as fungal pathogens, not so much with bonsai, but you get waterlogged soils. Frost damage is quite a significant one, and also heat damage. So think about how your trees are coping in hot summers. Think that they're in a ceramic pot that's in full sun possibly, and the roots are being superheated. They're being cooked really, because clay heats up. A lot of the clays particularly get really hot in the summer. And so this summer when you go out, test the warmth of your pots, and if need be, use things like bits of, not suggesting that we're all a bit conspiracy theory, but things like tin foil and putting a sort of shade at the front of your pots just to try and actually deflect some of the sun and the heat, because it can take the pressure off the root system. And you don't know your roots are superheating until you repot them in the winter and find that there's a lot of blackened and dead roots. It's because they died 6 months ago in the height of the summer. And when we had that really cold 2022 winter, one of the precursors to why a lot of people lost trees was because they'd already been damaged. They already had a weak root system from the hot summer that came first. So it's just something to think about, that damage can occur 6 months before you then see it. And it might even be 12 months before the actual end result. A lot of people's trees were suffering. Their root system was damaged, so their stored nutrient and food level was reduced. They then went through a really harsh winter. They weren't able to restore the root damage because they had damaged roots. They started to flush in the spring, but they just couldn't survive. And a lot of people lost some really good trees, particularly I think cotoneasters, pyrocanthus and Chinese elms that winter or that spring following. So things like ants, hopefully most of you don't have too many ant problems, but just be aware that if you have ants in the pots, then you need to make sure that you deal with it. It's not oh, well, it's fine. It's not, because the ants are basically trying to eat all the root tips, a bit like the vine weevil larvae. They want the sugariness. It's carbohydrate in the roots. So they will make homes in your nice bonsai pots because it's a warm, sheltered, protected environment for them to basically set up their little sort of beautiful, I've forgotten the name of ant tunnels, but there's a particular name. But anyway, so they will make homes in your pots, so you do need to treat for them. And ants have the amazing capacity to create air bubbles, so if you submerge your pot in water and leave your bonsai hydrating for a period of time, you won't get rid of ants. They can survive being submerged for quite long periods of time. So sometimes a repot is the only way to deal with ants. I would rather a repot than use the ant killer and the chemicals. And then in terms of vine weevils, everybody seen one? Here's a few up close pictures. So it's a little white legless grub that is basically actively feeding on the root tips of your trees in their pots. So totally protected from predators, and they will decimate your tree roots. I can show you how. So this was a tiny little dawn redwood clump that I had, and I wondered why it wasn't flushing. So when you get to spring and it's supposed to be pushing all its buds and hydrating its foliage and all of that and coming into leaf, this one just sat like this, and I was like, oh, there's something wrong. So I thought, time to give it a repot, and I think I found about 20 of these little friendly things in the pot with it, which was then, okay, so started to examine. Nearly every single root tip had basically been chewed off. There was very little live good root left in that pot with those little vine weevil larvae. So the frustration is that even closer up, you can see what they do is they strip off the fine root tip off every single root. So you wouldn't think something so innocuous could be quite so damaging to bonsai. Now, one of the reasons that I can control this or manage it is firstly take the grubs out and feed them to the robin. Second option is also to repot it back into a much more open, airy, gritty mix. They love really organic mixes, so they love peaty and sort of wet soils. So if you can try and change your bonsai soils to something that's less conducive for vine weevil, that does help. And then in terms of what to look for, this is the adult beetle. So that's what you're looking for when you go out in the greenhouse with your torch at night, and even during the day you will find them, and you just want to relocate them elsewhere away from your bonsai collection. There are ways of treating them if you are into chemical treatments. And you can also use things like nematodes. But for those that don't like the chemicals, blackbirds are your friend. So if you see a blackbird round your pots, it's listening for things in your pots. And it's a good indicator that you've got something in your pot if there's a blackbird hopping around your pot, listening round the sides. But yeah, try and use otherwise a freer draining mix. And I know that some of the traders use nematodes as a method of control also for that. I've not experimented with it. I've tended to repot and get rid of them. So, and then other things to look out for is slugs and snails. So making sure that if you do have a snail on your pot, okay, this one is a bronze one, but real ones, they are looking to set up homes with their eggs. So they will lay their eggs in your pots, and then the little snails will hatch out and start to defoliate your trees. So they are not a positive thing to have in your pots, really. And then root work options. So what can we do then? Once we've got our tree, we can do a full repot of all its roots, take it out, wash off the roots, not for every species. Some trees you might even remove all the roots, and we'll talk about what time and which ones you do that for in a minute. And then selective root pruning. So you might thin out the number of roots. You might remove a structural root and then remove another structural root at the next repotting, because you're trying to improve the root system as you come through your development. Undercutting of roots. So if you've got 2 or 3 large structural roots that you need to lower in the pot, you might just do a linear score on the underside to take some of the tension out, and then you can actually start to guide the root down into the pot more. Like we showed earlier, you can peg or wire roots. Sometimes you might leave the whole root system intact but just cut round the edges, or otherwise just cut underneath the root plate to make it slightly thinner. Another technique is you cut out a particular wedge. So where you've got a root system that is really compact, but you don't want to disturb it like a pine, you might just cut out a wedge and then backfill that with fresh soil, and then add roots via grafting. And then time of repotting. So this always is quite controversial, but with the large tree industry, we repot from anywhere through late October through to March. So this is when tree nurseries and commercial nurseries will be lifting their trees in October in preparation for the planting season. So you'll see them go into the fields and start to lift the trees, root ball them or put them in containers for containerized selling, and then those will be shipped out to various tree nurseries to sell on commercially, and then planted up as soon as viable, really. Container grown you can plant most of the year, but ideally the planting season is October through to March. And at the moment we're still in the height of the planting season, so local authorities, that sort of thing, will be planting out hundreds of trees at this time of year. And containers, as I say, autumn through winter. But if you are desperate, you can repot or plant a containerized tree in a different season, but you just need to follow with the aftercare. And bare rootstock always, usually autumn to winter when the trees are dormant. And this is for broadleaf mainly. Evergreens need to be more active when you sort of lift them. So you talk about sort of March, April, when the soils get slightly warmer and they start to really become more active both above and below ground. And I do tropicals, so I repot my tropicals any time of the year because their environment doesn't change because they stay inside. So they've got an even temperature, they're not subject to defoliation and frosts, so I can generally repot them any time. So in terms of when I repot generally ideally before Christmas. So I like to get most of my repotting done before Christmas, because over the years I've seen that sort of like there's usually less frost before Christmas, with the exception of last year and 2022. It actually seems to be quite mild. And so if you repot the other side of Christmas, i.e. before Christmas, you find that actually you've disturbed the roots, you've damaged the root system, and then you've got 6 to 8 weeks over that mild winter period where the roots can fix themselves, they can regrow, they can adjust to the root pruning you've done. And then about now I can start feeding because they've been repotted 6 or 8 weeks ago. Before they start to fully come into leaf but they're pushing bud, I could start to gently feed them. Whereas if I'm repotting now or into March, they're already quite active, and I can't feed for 6 to 8 weeks is the general guidance, because you're then feeding damaged roots. So I've gained 6 to 8, if not 10 weeks by repotting earlier in the season. In bonsai, we tended, when I first started, everyone's like, oh, repotting season, February, March. And I was like, oh, okay. But having worked with the trees long enough now, most of mine have got into a routine, and you can repot a lot earlier than you think. If you've got your trees into a routine and they cope with repotting when you're doing it, you don't have to change it, but you actually can start feeding sooner if you repot them sooner. It's just something that, again, a lot of people find it's sort of a bit strange when you suddenly suggest that they repot perhaps in November, December. But if your tree has, as a broadleaf, dropped all its leaves, it's settled down for the winter without leaf, then there's no reason why you couldn't repot it earlier. If it hasn't dropped its leaves, then wait for it to do it. But the other advice is that if you've got a tree that's struggling, don't wait for the right season to repot it. Just repot it. Now, it may be that you've got a tree in a small bonsai pot that's really struggling, but you don't want to disturb the roots fully, so you'll just take it out of the pot it's in, put it in a bigger pot, not quite, something slightly bigger than that, and just backfill it with something like large pumice. So you're not fully repotting it and disturbing the roots, but you're giving it an aerated root system space to grow into. And we've used that technique on pumice for a big black pine that was struggling, that we got them in the height of the summer. And we didn't want to disturb the root system, but we knew that they were pot bound and really struggling with the root system they had. So to give them that extra space in a bigger pot and give them that chance to naturally recover without intervention. So it's just something to think about.